Hello, everybody. Yeah, I know Dr. J is going to run her her presentation. So you might want to pin her presentation or just do a speaker view to get the wider view instead of sharing the screens. So welcome to Monday, March 1st. We want to thank today's meeting sponsor. The day sponsor is William A. Smith & Son Insurance Agency, and the session sponsors are D&W Industrial Services, G4 Kegs, Teal Becker, and Shermont CPAs. We really appreciate their support for this online conference, this virtual conference. Even though sadly enough we couldn't be together, and I know I'm saying this a lot, but I'm glad you all are taking the time to see value in these sessions and are joining us. And I couldn't be more happy to have Dr. J again for this. She was the keynote. She did an amazing keynote. And this particular, to have her a second time to give a little bit of a deeper dive into things is a real privilege for us. And so for those who do not know Dr. J, let me tell you a little bit about her. Dr. J. Nikol Jackson Beckham, or as we all fondly know her as, is Dr. J. She was slated again to be our 2019 keynote. She was gracious enough to be our keynote again this year, especially since community is such a big part of what we're trying to do with the NYSBA. So she was our keynote again this year and gave a great talk. For those who are watching this on video, you can find that on our YouTube page right now and watch that keynote as well. This will also be on our YouTube page for those that are watching live. Although COVID did slow down our diversity and inclusion efforts, it didn't stop them altogether. The NYSBA, the New York City Brewers Guild was already working hard on their inclusivity efforts. So we teamed up with them to launch our statewide inclusivity committee, which is chaired by NYSBA board member Sophia Barbaresco. And we get a lot of help from Ann Riley, who is the New York City Brewers Guild executive director. So thank you, Ann. And over the past year, we've been consulting with Dr. J, and she's actually been a really important voice to our efforts, and also by doing things like this. She is a former professor at Randolph College in Lynchburg, Virginia, and Dr. J now serves for the Brewers Association as their equity inclusion partner and as a consultant through her Crafted for All initiative. So today, Dr. J's talk is entitled, "We Need a Bigger Pie, Pipeline Development and Recruitment Strategies." There will be time at the end for questions, or if you have any burning questions during, throw them in the chat, and we'll make sure that you call them out. And there are no bad questions. So please don't be afraid to ask questions. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. J. Thank you for once again being a part of this.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Hello, everybody. How are you doing? First of all, as Paul just said, rather than sharing my screen, I'm going to be kind of flipping back and forth between a PowerPoint presentation. So it may be easier if you go to speaker view or pin me so that you can see those slides in their full size. I'll also say, this group is a delightfully controllable size, so we can do some kind of live Q&A back and forth. We're small enough to do that, and that's really exciting. Talking at the screen is fun, but it's funner when people talk back. So if you all have questions, please toss them in the chat at any point during the presentation, and I might actually invite you to come on the screen and chat a little bit. So please think of this as more of a kind of interactive workshop. And as Paul also mentioned, this is a little bit of a deeper dive, right? So like last time, if you saw the keynote, that was a little bit top level. Today we're going to get a little bit more tactical and talk about a burning issue that I come across quite a lot in the industry. And so, this title comes from this one observation that I've kind of seen over and over again, and that is that, even with COVID, right? Paul mentioned this on Monday last week. Even with COVID, we are still adding breweries. nationwide and in the state, to total number of breweries. But our sales volume is not keeping pace, right? It's not increasing quite as fast. And so rather than kind of cannibalizing, the same folks that are our customers and the same folks that are in our employee pipeline, when everybody's trying to get a slice of the pie, instead of kind of getting more competitive over the same pie, I just kind of say, like, we just need bigger pie, right? Like, we need more, and there's plenty of pie out there. If you saw some of the statistics that I presented in the keynote, you'll notice that we have plenty of opportunity to reach people who are currently underserved by the industry. So today we're going to talk very specifically about two related processes: employment pipeline development and hiring practices. And we're going to specifically look at how we can make those practices more inclusive, more equitable, and more just, in the hope of driving more diversity into our staffs and teams. So let me tell you quickly what we're going to cover today. So first, I just want to talk really briefly about a business case for diversity, because I think when you're talking about hiring and things like strategically building your team, it's really important to think about the why, right? Why is this worthwhile? What's the business case for doing this? Second, we're going to look at the first half of the equation, which is in the employment pipeline development, and talk about 4 strategies for doing this. Then we're going to switch over to the second half of the equation, which is hiring, and specifically drilling down on hiring bias and eliminating it. And then I'll just share again some resources that we have available from the Brewers Association to help you out with your journey. So first, we're going to talk about a business case for diversity. Now, I'll demonstrate it through a little exercise that I want you to take back to your spaces once you have an opportunity to talk to a bunch of people on your staff, on your teams at the same time. It's a fun little thought exercise. So I kind of call this the demolition exercise, right? And I'll briefly go through it with you today. So here's a hypothetical scenario for you all, right? There is a building, right? 5-story building occupying a prime piece of real estate that you realize is a perfect for the location of your brewery move, your brewery expansion, a new tap room, et cetera, right? But that building isn't worth salvaging. You got to bring it down, right? It's got to be demolished. If you sat down and you only had about 2 minutes to think about how to go about demolishing the building, right? What's your strategy? What's your approach? How to get the building down? So if any of you who are thinking about this right now want to jump in and just say, like, what came to the top of your head, please do so.
Just knock it down with a bulldozer?
Bulldozer. Big tools. How many of you, were there some other big tools out there?
Explosives for those that want to go bigger.
Yeah.
They got who's around.
Call the contractor. Good job. Implosion. Bring it down, Anne. I see you. Right. Any other major kind of different approaches out there?
I was thinking a wrecking ball.
Wrecking ball. Yeah. Okay. With Paul on Team Big Tools.
I think you want to take it from the base.
Okay. Yeah. So like, don't take it off the top, base first.
I mean, if you're being really careful, I suppose that might be the right way, but if you hit it at the bottom, it all collapses.
Yeah.
If you do that carefully, it's more.
Awesome. Any other ideas out there? Things come to mind for you all? All right. So the reason I want you to take this exercise is because inevitably somebody gives you an answer that either you were like, yep, that's what I was thinking, or you're like, what? I mean, that didn't even occur to me, right? And I've gotten things like, I would bring in an environmental materials person to see if anything in the building was salvageable. Someone would say, I'd bring in a safety person to see if there's any risk to the surrounding neighborhood in bringing the building down. Some people are like, I would blow the footings first, right? Like, and go straight to the technical details. Some people are like, I would put an RFP out for a contractor who could do it at the best price, right? What's interesting is all of these are not wrong, right? These are all interesting approaches. And inevitably, you weren't going to come up with something that was actually a terribly good idea that somebody else came up with. And a lot of times the things that they come up with are a product of their experiences, a product of what's happened to them in the past, or how they think. And I think this exercise for me does a really great job of demonstrating both the advantages and the pitfalls of either having or lacking diversity on your team. Diversity tends to bring you lots of different approaches to solving problems, lots of different experiences to innovating, and lots of different ways of looking at things. So there's some real tactical advantages to cultivating diverse teams. Specifically, McKinsey and Company, which is a great leader in doing business consulting research, reported that companies in the bottom quartile for both gender and ethnic or cultural diversity are 29% less likely to achieve above average profitability than their competitors, right? And if you look at the research around, we constantly hear this message, right? That diversity in teams is usually associated with profitability. And so if you're not leading, you're lagging. So a couple other things you want to think about in terms of what this business case for diversity is. As we just kind of quickly illustrated, variation in talent, skills, and experiences is really valuable when you're thinking about meeting challenges, right? There's greater innovation. There's a really beautiful book that illustrates that diverse teams of people who are average to above average in terms of achievement will always be innovative than one exceptional individual, right? And that's a really valuable lesson for business owners to take, right? You get better problem solving, and in terms of having kind of connections that people can bring you, you get keys to open more doors, relevant to what we're talking about, a larger talent pool, and more connections to your community. So there's a really, really strong business case for thinking about diversity in terms of building innovative and resilient teams. Yeah, go ahead.
I resonate a lot with that last point. I'm glad you bring it up, because so often in business we discover that, whatever resources you have, one of the biggest ones is your networking capabilities and who you know, and who's going to end up being, the person who, I don't know, can lend you a bunch of traffic cones when you stage an event, and oh, you didn't think of that. Or, like in Buffalo, a lot of times we talk about how you got to know a guy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know that that's a pretty gendered term, but you get the point.
Yep.
You do got to know somebody, but it's ungendered, I guess. And the more people you know, the more people you know, right? So
Yep, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Which is a great point. Which is also a really great segue to something that you all probably already know, but we have numbers, right? Craft is actually not leading, right, when it comes to creating diverse teams. So one of the kind of bigger projects that I took on as the diversity ambassador for the Brewers Association was thinking more strategically about how we conduct and utilize research. And one of our first kind of big goals as the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee was to run a benchmark so that we could actually tell who is part of our industry. So in 2019, we ran our first Diversity and Inclusion benchmarking survey. This would have been part of our human resources benchmark that the Brewers Association sends out. And there were essentially just two questions at the time, kind of asking about the racial and ethnic identity of the folks that work in your breweries, and a second question about the gender identity of folks who work in breweries. We will be re-upping on the survey pretty soon, and this time we hope to add veteran status, disability status, and sexual orientation to the survey. We had, unfortunately, with that latter point, until federal law made folks a protected employment class, there was a little bit of risk associated with asking that question. So we're excited to gain some more information going forward. So as you can see this chart right here, there's a pretty consistent story being told. There's just essentially not a whole lot of racial and ethnic diversity among those who work in craft breweries. And all or most of the racial and ethnic diversity is actually concentrated in particular roles, specifically in non-leadership roles in production and front of the house. You see pretty much the same thing mirrored in terms of gender diversity. Again, the vast majority of gender diversity is in front of the house positions, disproportionately in non-production positions and non-leadership positions. You do see a really healthy amount of women in ownership positions. However, the vast majority of that are women who are in teams. Ownership teams. There are not a lot of independent female owners out there. So, you know, the interesting part about this is that those kinds of imbalances and disparities tend to kind of perpetuate themselves, right? And so today we're going to talk about some strategies that we can take to kind of break that cycle of self-perpetuating and really think about ways to diversify the teams that we have. So we're going to start by first talking about employment pipeline development. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, it's really very similar to what it sounds like. There is a pipeline, right, of folks who are your potential hires. I think of people in the pipeline as not necessarily everybody out in the labor force, right? I think of this as the qualified labor force, and people who, if hired, are kind of ready to step in and make a contribution in your job. So most folks that I've talked to don't necessarily think about their employment pipeline. And I think one of the blessings and curses of our industry is that people really want to work in it, right? And when you have a ready-made group of people who are willing to kind of like wash kegs for free just to try to get their foot in the door, a lot of people don't put much active thought into cultivating an employment pipeline that is representative of their communities, or that is responding to specific diversity goals in their organization. So if this is the first time you've thought about your employment pipeline beyond just throwing the job up on Brewbound or on your social, you are absolutely not alone in that. So I'm going to walk through 4 specific strategies that you can think about in terms of developing a pipeline for success, and then some broader ideas to think about. And the first sounds probably a little simplistic, but it's important. And that is, you should make sure that your job announcements are inclusive, right? This is generally related for me to 4 specific aspects of the job announcement. First, your job announcement should reflect whatever your hiring goals are. Right? Now, I want to kind of be empathetic to the fact that for a lot of us, our hiring goals is like, put out the fire right now, right? Or like, I gotta get somebody in here immediately. And that's always going to be part of being a small business owner. I completely understand that. But there are also times when you can sit back and say, you know what, I can see the horizon, right, a little bit further, and I'm going to think a little bit strategically about my hiring goals. It might be something like, you know what, we have a large proportion of Spanish-speaking residents of my area, and we would love to hire some more bilingual talent. Or We want to run an ASL tour. Maybe we can get somebody who's practicing ASL, and we can get somebody in there, right? So you may at some point have some space to think about what your hiring goals may be. And personally, I am kind of in this space right now. I am cautiously optimistic about the direction that COVID is going. And I think we're about to do a crap load of hiring in this industry 6 to 12 months out, right? And I think if ever there was an opportunity to start thinking about developing an employment pipeline, it's now, right? So thinking about what your hiring goals are, other than putting a body in that can do the job. Second, you need to think about your employment announcements as a way to communicate about your culture, right? So unfortunately, I feel like the experience I've had with this thus far is not been particularly positive. There have been some cultures that maybe have some issues, and the issues show up in their job announcements. But I'd like to tell people, think about what your best qualities are about your brewery, about your business, and try to communicate those qualities in your brewery. So I'm so shocked sometimes when I see like small family oriented breweries that are like so down to earth throw up these super stuffy job announcements, right? And I'm like, that's not who you are, right? Talk about your culture, speak in the language of your culture as you write these announcements. Third, and probably a no-brainer, avoid biasing language. There's a lot of research out there with regard to biasing language, specifically language that is gender biased. Women have traditionally been like really sensitive to language that suggests the culture might be hostile toward them. So you should be careful about using language that might be, yes, there is a lot of that, Anne, that could be off-putting, right? And it doesn't have to be like people are seeing it and feeling like, oh gosh, I'm offended in this moment. It happens subconsciously, right? Like it's something that's kind of rubbing you wrong, and you're just like, yeah, that's not the place for me. And then finally, and I think this is probably the most important part, you need to anticipate the barriers that your potential applicants might run into as a result of seeing your job posting. So what does this look like? Well, I'm going to show you an example of some language from the job posting that I actually just used to hire my employee, Lewis, who is a wonderful person. So I'll kind of walk you through a couple specific things. You'll notice at the beginning, I said the successful candidate, not the ideal candidate. There's a lot of research that says that people see that word ideal, an ideal candidate, and say, well, I maybe could do this job, but I'm not ideal, right? And then they self-select out. So I try to be really conscious about, you're just going to be successful here. I kind of put down things that I think are really important, and specifically, I talked about why they're important for me. So, I said I need somebody for a knack for catching typos, because I'm prone to making them, right? I'm very good at typos. For me, it was important for people to know, like, I'm not that serious, right? Like, this job posting can have a little bit of humor that's communicating the culture of my small consultancy. And then I've read a lot of information about why people self-select out of jobs, right? Why people see a job posting and decide not to apply. And so I added this little section on the bottom of my job announcement that says, yes, you should still apply if, right? And I specifically addressed every reason, every barrier I thought someone might run into that would convince them not to apply for that job. So, maybe they're like, oh, I don't have a college degree, I can't do this. So I just said, yeah, no, you don't need a lot of formal education. They might be like, oh, I've never worked in craft beer. And I'm like, nope, you don't need to have worked in craft beer. In fact, I would love to show you around, right? They might say, "Oh, okay, I've been in the criminal justice system. People are not welcoming." I'd be like, "Nope, I'm all for second chances, right? Willing to work with you." Someone might need flexible working hours. I hired during COVID, so this was particularly important. I made sure people knew that. And then finally, just people who are like, "I think I could do this job, but I don't think I'm perfect." And I was like, you know what? Apply anyway. Right? You'd be surprised how many people actually sent an application and then specifically sent a thank you for the job announcement, just saying like, "Wow, I felt really awesome about that. Thank you so much." Right? Small change, but for me, like it helped me find a group of people that really were going to work for me. And my hiring process was agonizing, not because I couldn't find talent, but because I've had so many people that seemed like they would be a good match for the position. So second strategy we're going to get into is developing an employer brand. So everybody out there is like used to getting everything they want on the interwebs, right? Like immediately right now, all the information I want. And if you've looked for a job recently, you probably did this. You went online and you stalked the heck out of that company because the information is out there. So lesson learned, right? Job seekers both want to and expect to be able to find information about what it's like to work for your company online. Right? So what you can actually do is develop something called an employer brand that is specifically there for them to find it. Now, generally, craft breweries rely upon their consumer brand to be their employer brand, right? So if you're kind of outdoorsy, nature, fun-loving brewery for your consumers, then you're like, "Oh no, we're the same for our employees," which may be true, but there's an inherent weakness here, and that is you probably will only ever hire your consumer fans. Right? And if you want to hire beyond folks who are already your consumer fans, then you probably need to have an employer brand in place. So what goes into an employer brand? For me, a really important piece is evergreen information about what it's like to work for your organization, not just when you're hiring. So if I go to your careers page and there's nothing there because you're not hiring, that's a missed opportunity. You can populate that page with evergreen information that's really just about like, what is it like to work here? I don't necessarily mean pay rates, benefits, or anything like that. It really can be information that's like photos and narratives from people who work there, things like diversity and inclusion statements, right? The things you want people to know about the experience of being your employee. On the other side of things, information that isn't evergreen but is kind of rolling, you can use social media to really great effect here. I've seen some companies do essentially like day in the life posts where they essentially kind of turn over their social media to one of their employees and have them kind of post about what it's like to work in their job throughout the day. This is a really awesome way to introduce people to jobs that are unexpected or unknown among your population. You'd be surprised how many people I talk to about, "Hey, have you looked in the brewing industry for employment opportunities?" And they're like, "Well, I don't make beer." Right? And I was like, there are so many jobs in the brewing industry that don't involve making beer. Like, and people don't know this. So I think, putting your quality person right out on social media, putting your sales force out on social media, putting your production packaging people out on social media, putting your events planners out on social media really helps people understand like, wow, there are a lot of different careers available for me in this sector, and now I'm going to start watching it. Right? A kind of side benefit of doing this is if you involve your current employees in the process, it creates more employee engagement among your existing employees, right? Because they get to be a part of the process of saying like, yeah, check out where we work and what we do. We're proud of this space. And you can generate a lot of anticipation, a lot of knowledge among people by cultivating this employer brand, excuse me. The third thing you might look at, and Ethan, I will grab you in just a minute, is strategic job placement announcement. And here we're just talking about the process of getting more eyeballs on your job announcements. So let me pause for a moment. Ethan, you had a question.
It wasn't so much a question, but I will say that there are sometimes, I mean, maybe there are always pros and cons to everything.
Yeah.
We love our employees. We treat them like a team or family, but I think team's better because family is a bit of a trap sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Here's some pizza. But they, okay, some don't want to be featured or a part of your social media, which is fine, of course. You always want to make sure that in your efforts to grow this employer culture, which I've never heard of, I like that. You know, you're making sure that people are willing participants. But as well, you know, some people won't always be in your company. And boy, it gets harder to fire the people that you've turned into social media stars accidentally.
Yeah, true. And I think in some ways that might be a kind of a risk you have to take, hoping that those folks kind of stick around or leave amicably at the least, right?
With any luck, if you're doing it right, people don't stop off in a huff typically, but
Yeah,
not always up
typically. Yep.
Always up.
Totally get that. Thank you. In terms of strategic announcements, right? Placements of your announcements. We're talking about getting more ideas, more eyeballs on those announcements, right? Like now you've got these beautiful, non-biased, well-crafted job announcements. How do you get them in front of different folks? So just a couple of suggestions. This list could be honestly sort of endless, but I think the important part is if you're only using your own social or industry platforms, again, you're missing opportunities. So a couple of places that I really kind of love to look is social media communities and those folks who dare to call themselves influencers. So homebrew clubs, enthusiast groups like Girls Pine Out are great places to just pass around job openings. Neighborhood and community listservs. So like my neighborhood, right around here, we have a group of neighbors who are just like really jazzed about organizing. During COVID, they brought food trucks to the cul-de-sac in our neighborhood because they're like, nobody can go out to eat, let's do food trucks. And they have a Facebook group that's pretty lively, and people are having yard sales, right, or anything like that. It goes up in there, and that's a great place. Like people often drop little notes like, hey, XYZ is hiring, here's what they're looking for. Those are great ways to keep local connections to your community. Similarly, community listservs of any type are really great. You can think about educational and training programs, and I mean not just brewery education programs. If you need an HR person, right, that local college has a business school, and you could throw it up to the business, dean of the business school and say, hey, we're looking for an HR person. Here's something to look at. Weirdly, a lot of people only look at brewery education, but there's a lot of training and education folks out there. And then events and appearances are oftentimes a lost opportunity. A couple breweries I know will, they're at a festival or pouring and they got a jockey box, and they'll just take a stack of applications with them, right? If they meet like interesting, engaging people and be like, hey, if you want to drop an application, here you go, right? We'll keep them on file, and if we find a match, that's something to do. I think the idea here really is to not just increase the number of eyeballs, but different types of eyeballs that see your job announcements. Finally, I would say that you can look at productive partnerships. And partnerships are a little bit more kind of high touch, closer working relationships with folks who might feed your employment pipeline. One of the most kind of robust things are workforce development agencies. So certainly you have a workforce development agency at the state level. They're almost ubiquitous on the municipal level. And this is usually government agencies, often in partnership with nonprofit agencies who are looking to develop the viable talent workforce and match candidates with employers. And oftentimes these are efforts that not only help individuals, but are meant to kind of help folks who might have barriers to being, career-oriented employment. So there's a kind of a social justice bend, right, to making this choice as well. The wonderful thing about workforce development agencies is they often are willing to do all the work, right? Like they will match you with folks, they will invite you to places. Oftentimes it is a very low lift for potential employers. So I highly suggest you take a look there. There's a lot of community nonprofits out there that also focus on developing workforce talent, specifically around vulnerable populations. Training in vocational institutions, same thing, great places to partner with. And then you can be creative about other types of values aligned feeders, right? Surprising number of organizations that maybe share some sort of values commitment with you, whether it's sustainability or philanthropy or your youth sports or anything that your kind of values aligned with. There's probably an organization out there that might could in an interesting way be a feeder for your employment pipeline. As you consider all 4 of these strategies, here are 3 things that I think are really important to think about. First, I would say ditch the deficit mindset and use asset-based thinking. So what I mean by deficit mindset, often, right, when I'm talking about providing job opportunities or even cultivating new fans, people immediately go to charity, right? What kind of charity can we provide, or what can we teach, or what do we have to offer? And I always tell people, like, be careful of having a deficit mindset about underrepresented populations, right? Only seeing them through the eyes of what they lack. And start thinking with asset-based thinking, right? Like, what assets do these populations have that I lack, right? And so what can they bring to the table? Again, it might be greater connections, it might be greater cultural literacy, it might be skills, knowledge that you just don't have, right? But looking towards those populations with an asset-based cap on will really help you kind of keep your hiring goals aligned. Secondly, hire for culture growth, not culture fit. And I'll talk a little bit more in this about culture fit in just a little bit. But a lot of people kind of say, well, we got to make sure people fit in, right? We don't want to hire someone who's like completely doesn't share our values. And I get that, right? But the metaphor I like to use is like a car, right? If my car's not running well, I don't go down to the AutoZone and say, like, I need 15 carburetors, right? Like, my car needs 1 carburetor. It doesn't need a whole bunch of the same part. Those parts are redundant and it won't make my car work better, right? I need a whole bunch of different parts that fit together in order to make my car run. And so rather than looking for like the same person over and over again because they fit, the idea is to think about how can I hire for growth, where I can have differences that work together, right, to further the goals of this program. So that's the first half, right? Pipeline development. I spent a lot of time on it because I think it's important. The second piece we're going to talk about here is identifying and eliminating hiring bias, right? So this is the hiring part. Now, hiring has a whole bunch of components, but right now I just want to focus on the bias conversation because I think it's really important. And before we kind of talk about types of hiring bias and what you can do to get rid of them, I want to tell you a little bit of a story just to kind of like orient how we're thinking about this. Now, I work in, I have a consultancy, I work in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. And a lot of people ask me like, hey, Dr. J, can you come do some implicit bias training? And my answer is always no, absolutely not. And people are like, whoa, why? And I was like, because it doesn't work, right? And a lot of people are like, wait, what? Right. And so I have to qualify. Standalone implicit bias training is proven through the research to be not very helpful. Right? In fact, in some cases, it actually makes people more hostile towards groups who might be the victims of implicit bias. And the question of like why it doesn't work or what's missing from the equation, I think I can communicate in a little bit of a different story. So when I lived in San Diego a while ago, I did my master's degree there, and a colleague of mine was working on a research project with some local schools. We were in communication studies field, and they were like, you know, we're having some issues with the high schoolers in this particular school district. There was an outbreak of syphilis, which I really was like, I didn't know people still got syphilis, but apparently a whole bunch of high schoolers were getting it in Southern California. And they were like, clearly we're having an issue with communicating, right, our health curriculum. So her and her team went in and were like, okay, let's see what's going on. So they did a whole bunch of surveying and interviewing. And what they realized at the end was that there was absolutely no problem with communicating the health curriculum. Right? All of the students knew exactly what was at risk, right? Like they were like, yep, completely understand it. Completely understand what I should do, completely understand what I'm risking if I don't do it. And in fact, I even feel like I have plenty of access to things to protect myself. Guidance counselor has a bowl of barrier condoms in her office. I just grab a handful before I leave school, right? So everybody's like, well, what the hell, right? Like if they know what's going on, why is this happening? And so when they looked into what was actually going on, the students said things like, I mean, I know it's risky, but like in the moment, I just didn't know what to say. Right. Or they're just like, I mean, it was super awkward and I didn't want anybody getting like mad. I didn't want the whole situation to like stop. So I just was like, okay, just this time. Right. And so what they found out was it wasn't an issue of knowing what to do. It was an issue of having the confidence to do it and the competence to do it in the moment, right? The confidence and the communication competence in the moment. In the research, we call this discretion, right? There was a kind of a pain point, and those people had to use their discretion to figure out what was going on. And what we realize is that when people are put in pressure situations and they have to use discretion, they will often kind of take familiar or easy routes out, right? And what we realize is the same thing happens with bias situations. So people can get all the bias training in the world, but when a pressure situation happens, often people's discretion breaks down and they don't make the decision that the training would have them make. So the question is, how do we get rid of bias? And for me, this is about discretion removal, right? So in those moments when you have the pain point, you have to say, like, let's externalize the decision-making to a tool so that it doesn't rely upon personal discretion. All right, so types of hiring bias. I am happy to report that most people in our industry can avoid like egregious cultural bias, right? Like people can manage not to be like horribly stereotypical asses for the most part. So the types of bias we're talking about are a little bit trickier and harder to weed out. Right? And I think about 5 types of bias in our industry really specifically. The first is certainly for me the most egregious, that is affinity bias. And affinity bias is simply the tendency to favor people who are like yourself, right? Those who are part of the same group. And just like sexism and racism, it's totally unfair, but it doesn't feel like it because it feels like cultural fit, right? So I always tell people, if you are thinking about this hiring decision and you felt yourself saying something like, I could totally have a beer with her, be careful, right? Like you may be falling victim to affinity bias. Like, I like you because you're like me. Second kind of bias you might look at is anchoring bias. This is fixating on one piece of information and as a result, giving it more weight than it should, right? And for craft breweries, the love of craft beer is often that anchor that makes us go, oh, they're amazing, right? When a lot of times loving craft beer might actually have no bearing on how successfully you can do the job, right? So anchoring bias, right, is when you kind of let one piece of information kind of anchor your perceptions about someone, even if that piece of information is not particularly important to them being successful. Consensus bias tends to happen when you're hiring in groups. This is essentially when you shift your opinions to be more consistent with someone else's during the discussion process. As you probably can imagine, this often happens when leadership is part of the discussion process, and then those people who are kind of further down on, on leadership organization chart might be like, I really love this person. And then the person in leadership's like, I don't know, I thought they were a little whatever. And you're like, yeah, they were a little, yeah, whatever. Yeah, what you said, right? So that tendency to kind of lean towards consensus, that can be harmful. We also have confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency to seek out information that confirms our pre-existing opinions about someone. So if your first impression or your review of their resume kind of got you to kind of form some sort of pre-existing or preconceived notion about them, you might actually start seeking out things unconsciously that verify your preconceptions by shifting your line of questioning in a particular way. And then last, we look at the halo effect. This is essentially just an determination of first impression. So if someone is really charismatic and awesome and they come through the door and you're like, oh, wow, you're awesome and you're a ball of energy, that first impression might actually positively color your experience through the interview throughout, even if they're actually not performing that well in the rest of the interview. Similarly, someone who might not be exuberant or personable, it may work in their favor or negatively in their favor. And there's a good reason to be really wary about this. So ways to kind of combat these common types of hiring bias. First strategy I would say is make sure you're using a goal-directed process. Right? If you're able to do a hiring process with some forethought, right? You've done some pipeline development and you have some goals and strategies for your hiring, right? Stick to the goals that you have established. Your hiring goals should not be a moving target. Right? Second, use your job announcements and strategic priorities to guide that process. I always, does anybody out there watch dog shows? Any dog show fans? No, I'm a freak about dog shows. I freaking love them. They're amazing.
I love dog shows.
Yes. Okay, good. So I have a 13-year-old. He was watching The National with me recently and was just like, so what's going on? They're just like, it's like, which dog is cuter? And I was like, no, so I had to explain that like every breed has a standard, right? And the judge knows all the standards perfectly. And they, sorry. And so the judge is judging the dog up against the standard. If you all are BJCP judges or Cicerones, right? Judging table works the same way. If I got a Schwarzbier, I'm judging the Schwarzbier to the standard of Schwarzbier, right? And if I got a Whippet or a PBGB, I'm, judging that dog against the standard for its breed, right? I think your job announcement can actually function this way for you, right? So if you put that you have purposely crafted this job announcement in this particular way to put it out in the world, then when you're evaluating your talent, you're saying, okay, who's meeting the mark on this job announcement best, right? A lot of times we just don't connect the announcements to the evaluation of the process. But if we connect them, we can kind of stay clear on these goals, right? And then, related to connection, make sure that your goals in hiring are connected to a broader mission, purpose, or function for your organization. If your organization is looking to do more community involvement, hire people who can get you better community involvement. right? Think of your broader goals and hire to meet those goals. Secondly, right, make sure you identify and account for high bias moments. That's when you're going to want to lean on the tools and get rid of your own discretion as much as possible. Two high bias moments in my estimation are the materials review, like when you're going through the stack of applications or resumes, and the interview, right, that particular moment. So what you want to do is make sure that you have tools that allow you to lean on those tools in those moments, because that's when bias is most likely to come in. Right? So how do you lean on it? For me, it's about developing a hiring kit. These can look very different, but there's a couple things that I think can go into your hiring kits. So sorry, I'm just laughing at the Chloe love right now. Three things that I think you should stick in your hiring kits if you're developing them. First, you can put some basic training materials in them. And this, if you're going to do some implicit bias education, right, inform people about what kinds of bias they might run into, this is a good place to do it, right? Rather than doing that like that organization-wide training that everybody hated, right? It's localized. It's saying, hey, you're hiring, you're sitting on a hiring committee, or you're a hiring manager. Make sure you're thinking about these things when you're talking to folks, right? Second, your hiring kit can include evaluation rubrics. I love an evaluation rubric, and this is literally like a score sheet. I was like I played sports a lot, but I also did had to keep the books like at the table for basketball a lot, and I was like, foul that person. You can do the exact same thing for evaluation rubrics for your candidates, right? If you said you needed someone who has great people skills or has some experience making new relationships for your sales team, then you write that on your rubric, and you can create a system of just scoring, right? 1 point if they're not so good, 2 points if they're okay, 3 points if they're excellent. That way you have the same rubric for every candidate, and you're going apples to apples there. And it keeps you kind of clear, keeps you away from that anchoring bias, because you have right in front of you, these are the things I said are important. So I'm going to make sure that I'm hitting all these marks. Another thing you can throw into an interview, into a hiring kit is interview scripts. So if you're not asking every interview candidate the same question, you're inherently not giving them the same interview, right? And so questions that are kind of pre-thought about for your goals, for the positions you're hiring for, and what's going on are really, really helpful. And I would just keep in mind that people communicate in different ways. People respond to questioning in different ways. Allow a lot of space for people to respond in different ways to your questions. Right? Just to review, right, you've got this kind of front side of the process with your hiring pipeline, right? And I always think of it like a funnel, right? If you want something to come out the small end of the funnel, you got to make sure enough of it goes into the front. And a lot of times that's the piece that we're missing here. And then the hiring process, make sure you're using tools so that you kind of don't fall victim to different kinds of bias while you're doing the hiring process. I genuinely believe if you are kind of setting the table well and using a really equitable process, right, you're going to see a team eventually, maybe not instantly, that's more representative of a qualified labor force in your area. Right? Probably should go without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, right? The whole kind of diversity hire question, right, should be a non-starter. It is illegal to hire people based on any sort of consideration of their race, gender, right, religious status, nationality, pregnancy status, etc. Right? So we're talking about shifting the processes to open them up so they are more equitable, and so that we reach, right, and evaluate a greater proportion of our area. So very quickly, and I'll leave these last couple of minutes for questions. I mentioned that the Brewers Association has some resources to help you on your kind of equity and inclusion journey. These slides are in my keynote, so I'm not going to hit them super fast. or I'm going to hit them super fast, not going to hit them in a lot of details. There's some best practices available for download for BA members. Just hit the diversity and inclusion tab and look for resources, and you can download these. There's a diversity, equity, and inclusion board on the BA forums where you can have conversations and drop questions if you'd like. I monitor that very closely, and as do lots of members of the DEI committee. Our diversity and inclusion events grants program will be coming back online this summer after a forced hiatus because of COVID-19. If you are thinking about any particular types of events specifically, we've funded some hiring fairs that were specifically about hiring more diverse talent in a particular area. Make sure you stay tuned for that and submit an application. And then we just yesterday closed the application period for the first cohort of our mentorship program. And I absolutely think that folks who come out of the BA's mentorship program are going to be hungry and ready for their kind of foot in the door opportunity in terms of the craft beer industry. So please keep an eye on that as well. So with that, I will answer any questions that you all might have, and we'll go from there. Also, Chloe, what are you drinking?
I am, excuse me, I'm drinking a waffle. I'm drinking a beer that's a waffle stout that was actually gifted to my husband from one of his colleagues, and he doesn't work in beer at all, so it was a really big surprise when he just brought it upstairs.
Nice. Does it taste waffly?
It does taste waffly. That's why I was like, I'm drinking a waffle. Like,
Yeah.
it tastes a lot like a waffle.
That's kind of amazing.
Does anybody have any questions for Dr. J? Yep, Chris Erickson, who is a president of our board of directors, by the way, Dr. J. I just want to let you know that as well. I can't hear you. You don't look muted. Still can't hear you. You're not on mute. That's a new one.
Honestly, he's never sounded better.
Ooh. But it's weird. Yeah, he's not on mute, but we can't hear him.
He can hear us. Nice.
All right, he'll work on it. I have a quick question real quick while he's working on that. Do you find that a lot of people just are, so they're too, they want to be more inclusive and all of those great things that you just talked about, but they're too afraid to ask questions because they might ask them wrong or they might come off the wrong way. Do you feel like a lot of breweries have the right intention, but just don't know how to, I don't know, ask the right questions, or they're too afraid to do the wrong thing, I guess, would might be something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like some analysis paralysis.
Yeah.
Right. Like, yeah, absolutely. I think just broadly. And I always tell people, like, Dr. J said you could fuck it up. Right. Like, we have to, that's the benefit of a community like this, right? Like of a New York State Brewers Association, that you have a community who can be kind of generous and forgiving if you try and it doesn't go perfect, right? And, you know, newsflash, nothing you try is going to go perfect. But I think if you don't try, it's definitely not going to go well. So you might as well try.
Well, I mean, you gave me, like, I was afraid, like in putting the inclusivity committee together, I was afraid to ask, you know, I think I called you and you gave me some great advice. And my instinct was to check all the boxes on the committee. Mm-hmm. And you just said, look, you know, you would rather have a committee of, I don't know if you said all white people that make a difference rather than checking all the boxes and maybe they don't show up or maybe they don't, like, you just, you know, it's the end result that's the most important thing. And I was afraid to ask that question, but your answer was perfect.
Yeah, I mean, to that end, and this is something bigger, you know, and important to think about. Like, I always tell people, like, my skin color does not give me the skills I need to do this work. Right? Like the skills that I bring to bear in this work came from, like, lots of education and professional experience and training and study. Like I happen to be a Black person in the DEI space, but like my skin didn't do it. And so I always say, like, you know, talent is important, skill is important. The trick often is thinking about potential rather than performance. Right? So one of the things that I like to tell people is like, orient yourself to find high potential talent, right? People whose ceilings are really high, because hypo talent, that's kind of a HRE term, but your hypo talent are going to be people who will grow with your company, who are curious, who want to kind of make a job their own, right? Who may become leaders in the future. But what we tend to do is focus on high performing talent, right? People who have the degrees or the direct experience, who can demonstrate high performance, right? And there's a reason. Identifying high potential is much harder than identifying high performance. But the thing about high performance is that people might be at the ceiling, right? Like they might be like, I'm a high performer, but you're not getting one extra thing out of me. I'm not growing, I'm not changing. I like doing it this way, and that's all I'm ever going to do. Right? So we tend to focus on high performance, which has us kind of going back to the same bucket over and over again. But if we can shift to thinking about like, how do we think about high potential and cultivate different types of potential? Often that leads us to like a whole other world of folks, right? And we can think about diversifying experiences, diversifying backgrounds, diversifying skill sets, along those lines. And Chloe, I'm drinking water because.
Oh, that was a fancy cup. It looked cool.
No, we still can't hear you.
Can't hear you,
I
Chris.
want this question. This is important.
Can you type it or do some semaphore maybe? We're all watching Chris maybe type.
I know. I'm like, what's it saying?
Well, I think he's drinking an
Dang.
ubu, but I'm not sure. But oh no, he's drinking. His big slide. Oh no, Lake Placid.
Red IPA.
Nice.
Nice. That must be new. It must have just came out.
Was the keyboard not working either?
He's playing the air piano.
I don't know. That is a universal sign for him trying to type it. I think.
I didn't even realize until he put that beer up that he had a Zoom
background. Yeah, I thought he was like in a brew pub. Absolutely
getting way better. I'm impressed.
I thought so too, Ethan, earlier this week.
That's a good point, Eric.
I was actually trying to determine what size like vessel is behind him.
I know, right? If I had to
guess,
like
looks like a 10 or a 15, maybe.
Yeah, 10 maybe is what I was guessing.
Yeah. I appreciate your pointing out that, you know,
we were all wrong.
Good intentions only get you so far, and a systemic process really closes the gap, I guess, between having good intentions but not really knowing how to get from A to B. I think our brewery has gotten a lot out of just being like, hey, we're Community Beer Works, what did you think? And that's not wrong, but it's not the same as having systemic processes, SOPs, right? Like we have for everything else, for ensuring rather than hoping for the best when it comes to making sure that we are have diversity and inclusion.
Right.
So yeah.
Oh, I see Chris's question. First 7-barrel, got it. I should have known. Okay.
Yeah. Thought that's what Chris was going to ask.
It's hard because he's like got a little bit of foreshortening going. So 2 questions. Lack of diversity, right, in the area is a thing. And that's why one of the things I said on last week was like, you have to kind of look at your area and define what does diversity mean in that area, right? When I went and talked to Montana, I was like, look, guys, when the plane landed, I just moved your stats up, right? I made a material difference. you got to think kind of broader about like, what does diversity mean? Like, is this people, is this your vets? Is this people from different socioeconomic backgrounds? Is this like different nationalities, ethnic communities? Is this LGBTQ people? Is this people living with neurodiversity or other kind of impairments, right? Like, this idea that like, I want to kind of explode what diversity means and say like, this is just human difference, right? And like finding the kind of productive potential of putting human difference together, right? To build kind of teams full of people who think in different ways and bring different things to bear in your business, but like cooperatively and productively. Yeah, age, woo, yes. Right? And I think age is a great unifier across country. Like we are so shifted towards a younger demographic in the industry. But like, I just looked at some of the numbers that my colleague Bart just put up about how many boomers are buying beer and wine online. They outspent the millennials by a lot during online sales. And I was just like, if you aren't kind of thinking about the experiences of some of those older folks, you are missing out.
We had a lot of the demographic for, I don't know if you were thinking the same thing, Paul, just now, but for our virtual tasting experiences that we've done this year, we've had a demographic that surprised us, like over the age of 50. Like most of them were over the age of 50, 60, even 70. We had some people
Was huge.
consistently.
Yeah, I have a friend who works in social planning for retirement communities. Apparently this is like a huge field because when people go into like active retirement communities, it's basically like, okay, entertain us, right? Like we're maybe not going to play golf every day. And there was a survey done, like what if active adults want to do? And they said the two highest categories of activities were things that are educational and things that involve booze. And I was just like, opportunities.
Well, are there any final questions?
Yes.
We're a little bit over. If not, Dr. J, thank you again. We could spend hours with you, and we'll definitely have you back, soon and in person next time for sure. When you're in New
I would
York.
love to. Just jump on the train. It's perfect.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks everybody for being here. This will be on YouTube. Thanks to day sponsors, William A. Smith & Son Insurance Agency. Thank you for sponsoring the day. And thank you, Dr. J. We look forward to seeing you again.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everybody.
Nice to
Thank
see
you,
everybody.
See you.